Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you to Professor Tamer for inviting me to come and talk. It's really been a great couple of days, and I'm glad you've all got to the end of, or near the end. So I've got tomorrow as well. So today I'm going to be talking about angels, demons, and Jinn. I'm going to focus on them, although there are other creatures which, like the Houris or the winged horse Buraq, which are supernatural and possibly spiritual, but they don't easily fit into the category of angel. So I'll be passing over them, although they are interesting, these other sort of supernatural creatures. And I just wanted to note that because it shows that the spiritual world is more complicated than this discrete category of angels, demons, and jinn. There's tons of material out there in Muslim sources, too much for today, really. So I'm going to focus on the Quran and the Hadith literature. There was a handout, has that come around? Yeah, that's good. So that just has some of the quotations that I'll be mentioning. And it appears in theological works, philosophical works, folkloric texts like the Arabian Nights, all sorts of different texts. But I'll be focusing on the Quran and the Hadith and other texts as and when necessary. What I want today is a bit of an experiment for me. I really like semiotics and I really love Greimas-squares. If you don't know what they are, you'll see lots of them today. But they're a useful way of exploring binaries and semantic meaning. And what I've done is try to use them to try and explore how angels, jinn, and devils are different and how they are similar, to try and gain a deeper understanding of how Muslim texts understand what these categories of being are. So that's what I'll be doing. We'll save that for later. Right. So just a first general overview. So first, angels. There is the word for angel in Arabic is malak, malaika, which is a cognate of the Hebrew malach, malachim. However, I think it's really important to note that it doesn't carry the idea of messenger in Arabic texts. So it seems to become just the word used for a species of creature. I've argued this on various grounds, including the fact that there's a portion of the Quran which says, I send messengers from men and from angels. And if the Quran, if the Quranic audience understood the term malach to mean messenger, that would mean I send my messengers from my messengers and people, which would be a bit weird. And also, we don't see the use of the root very often, if at all. And we only ever see examples of the use of the roots alaka, la'aka, or even malaka in lexicographical works, which kind of shows that people didn't understand the term malak as a messenger, just in terms of it being a species. Angels are deeply infused in the Quranic imaginary. They're bringers of revelation. They populate the divine world. They usher in the dramatic events of the last day. They collect the souls of the dead. They keep watch over individuals. They aid the Muslims in battle. They intercede for humanity amongst many, many other things. And those are the sorts of things that we've already encountered so far in the talks on Judaism and Christianity. The Quran refers to two angels by name, Gabriel and Michael. It does refer to Malak al-Maut, the angel of death. But there are other angels that are referred to but not by name, such as the bearers of the throne, the Hamlat al-Arsh. But they're not very well developed in the Quran. And what you have to do is you have to turn to the Hadith literature, which supplies more information about all these different angels, which is what I looked at in my first book. Even within the Quran, there are competing descriptions of what angels look like. For example, in Surah 35:1, the angels are described as being winged, so with wings, as like that one. But in Surah Maryam 19:17, the angel that appears to Mary is described as a basharan sawiyan, which is hard to translate, but it usually is translated as something like a well-formed man, so somebody who looks like a human. And this seems to be a reflection of the mixed descriptions in the Bible, where in narrative traditions, narrative texts, we often see angels taking human form, and then when in prophetic texts, when prophets are brought into the divine world, angels have these huge, sort of impossible to imagine, vivid descriptions. Take, for example, this description of Gabriel, which is on your handout. When Muhammad ascended into heaven, he saw Gabriel in his true form, his wings strung with chrysolites, pearls and rubies. Muhammad said, "It seemed to me that the space between his eyes," so here, filled the horizon. So it's this huge being adorned with jewels and pearls, and just a sort of a really hard to imagine imagery of what the angel looks like. There's also this description of the angel al-rūḥ, the spirit, whose sole role is to glorify God. The spirit is an angel, has 70,000 faces, every face has 70,000 tongues, every tongue has 70,000 languages, which praise God in all those languages. From every act of praise, God creates an angel which flies from the angels, I don't think that should be right, anyway, until the day of resurrection. So here the strangeness of the angelic form is used to convey a real sense of otherworldliness, but also the description is used to convey an important theological and pietistic idea about the glorification of God and the fact that humans are not able to achieve in any way the worship that God is due. On their created substance, which I'll talk about quite a lot today, the Qur'an is silent, but in the Hadith literature they're described as being created out of light. And there are lots of debates about what this actually means. So now I want to turn to the Jinn, just a quick overview of what the Jinn are. The Jinn are the earthly, chthonic spirits that appear quite frequently in pre-Islamic poetry, and they were very much part of the pre-Islamic belief system. Quite often, Jinn are considered dangerous and were often encountered alone in the desert, so they're quite scary beings. Jinn do not have a physical body, and they are able to possess humans. Indeed, the word jinn and the Arabic word for madness, jinnah, and a madman, majnoon, all come from the same root, so they have the same concept. The idea of possession also appears in the Quran in the attacks on Muhammad by the Meccans. So when poets declaim their poetry in pre-Islamic Arabia, they would fall into an ecstatic state, a sort of trance, and were believed to be possessed by the jinn. And the Meccans accused Muhammad of being a poet, of being possessed by a jinn. And the Quran in its response declares that what Muhammad is reciting is not poetry, but a scripture and a revelation from God. So it sets up this dichotomy between what is happening to Muhammad and what happens to poets. The Quran describes itself as being revealed not just for Muhammad's audience, his human audience, but also for the jinn. So the Quran is a revelation for the jinn, which is mentioned particularly in Surah al-Jinn, Surah 72. Nikolai Sinai has noted that throughout the Meccan surahs, humans and jinn, al-ins wal al-jinn, are frequently paired to designate the totality of sub-celestial, i.e. non-divine, non-angelic, rational agents. Okay. The pairing of humans and the jinn is indicative of important similarities between the two groups, which raises some questions about how we understand the term spiritual, which is coming up, I think, quite a lot today, about where jinn, these particular creatures, fit in to the sort of cosmology of creation. Humans and jinn are both considered as having moral agency. That is, they're mukallaf. They're going to be judged at the end of time according to how they have lived and how they responded to the revelation of the Quran. So this puts jinn in a different category to angels and demons. Jinn also appear in narrative episodes in the Quran. That third picture on the right is a picture of Solomon and the jinn, which was really appears in the Quran, but also appears in folkloric material like al-Qiṣaṣ, al-Anbiyā'r, which give really elaborate accounts of his interaction with them. In these stories, the jinn have supernatural abilities, particularly in building and craft work. And Solomon gets them to build him a very elaborate moving throne. The descriptions are quite mad. It sort of rotates and has palm threads. It's quite mad. Anyway, as a punishment for idolatry having been committed in his palace, God allows a demon to steal a magic ring, which is how Solomon controls the jinn under his power. And there's a bit of a fight, and in the end, Solomon gets his ring back and casts that demon into the sea. And these ideas are really deeply rooted in a sort of popular, religious, probably or possibly pre-Islamic sort of idea or conception of jinn. So what we see in these stories about jinn is an element of Arabian identity bearing up in the conception of the world. The second important story about jinn is the story of Iblīs. So when God creates Adam, the angels protest at the fact that God is about to create something that's going to be sinful and spread corruption in the land. And they complain to God. God tells off the angels, explaining that they don't understand what he's doing. And when God has created Adam, God then commands the angels, specifically the angels, to bow down to Adam. All of the angels do, except for Iblīs, who refuses to out of a sense of pride. And Iblīs's pride comes from his belief that being made of fire, al-nar, is more worthy of honor than Adam is, who is made of mud. And God punishes Iblīs by expelling him from heaven, after which Iblīs vows to devote himself to corrupting Adam and his children, that is us, by leading them astray with whispers, in Arabic, the great word waswasa, and is then known as the devil al-Shaytan, the equivalent of the Hebrew title al-Hasatan. There's a big debate about whether Iblīs was a jinn or whether Iblīs was an angel, which is quite complicated. The Quran says that Iblīs is a jinn, but the story makes more sense in that account if Iblīs was an angel, because it says God commanded the angels to bow down to Adam, and Iblīs refuses and is punished for it. But the command was only for the angels. And the Muslim texts and theologians and exegetes get into lots of knots trying to explain how this all works and how Iblīs, if he was a jinn, was in heaven anyway. So there are lots of confusions around this. There seems to be early sort of mythical understandings of what's going on had led to some sort of confusion. So this leads us into the concept of devils, the shayateen, and there's a lack of clarity about who or what the shayateen are. Iblīs is described, as I just mentioned, as being one of the jinn in Surah 1850, which suggests there is a link between jinn and shayateen. And people like Nikolai Sinai have noted the interchangeability of the terms jinn and shayateen. Often they are just changed. And he argues that the designation shayateen picks out a subclass of jinn who are malicious, as opposed to the believing jinn who appear, for instance, in Surah 72. So for Sinai, the devils are like a subset of evil jinn. So they're not angels, but they're jinn, and then the evil ones are devils. I'm going to be exploring this in a bit later. What happens is the shayateens essentially become like the forces of evil with Iblīs, and they join his plan to lead as many people astray to a place of unbelief, kufr. In the Hadith literature, there's a huge fear of devils. For example, one Hadith says, "Lock your doors, tie up your water skins, and turn your vessels upside down or cover them, and extinguish your lamps. For the devil will not open a locked door or untie a string." So there's this real popular sort of belief that the devil will come and attack people at night. So the devils are things to be feared. The idea of devils is also used to try and encourage or discourage certain types of behavior, with things being disapproved of being described as the devil's work, with things to be encouraged being said to ward off the devil. And this covers a huge range of things, from avoiding luxury, singing, yawning, not wearing one sandal. I can explain that if you really want to, but it's quite bizarre. Saying a prayer before a meal, saying a prayer before entering a house, and so on. A huge number of things, but the devil is used to try and create or encourage people to act in certain ways or not do certain things. So, I now want to introduce you to a Greimas-square. I don't know how many of you have used these before, but it's a way of exploring two opposing terms and to try and unlock deeper meanings that are hidden underneath. And the best way to do it is actually to see one. So this is one which is used by the Canadian semiotician Louis Hébert, and he takes the terms masculine and feminine, the two parts of the binary, and you then take, that's got a bit corrupted, you'll just have to cope with that, you take the opposites, so not feminine and not masculine. And these ones on the bottom line are the more complex terms. And you build up things, so something that is both masculine and feminine would be a hermaphrodite. So that top layer encompasses both those two meanings of the binary. The bottom could be an angel. I can't quite remember why he argues that, but not male, not female. On the side, masculine and not feminine, he sort of uses the term macho to describe that something is both masculine and not feminine. And then a siren or something like that, so feminine, but also not masculine. Okay. So it's a way of building up an understanding of deeper levels of meaning between two terms. And I'm going to be using this to try and explore things in a bit more detail about angels. So, the first binary I want to explore is the binary of light and dark. This is expressed most clearly in a Hadith report that is widely reported and cited in discussions of the substance of created beings that's found in the Sahih of Muslim. The angels were created out of light, nur. The jinn were created out of smokeless fire, marij min nar, and Adam was created from what has been described to you in the Quran, i.e. earth or mud, something dark. Although the Quran doesn't give any details about what angels are created out of, the later Muslim sources are almost entirely unanimous in the belief that angels are created out of light. So it's very easy to place them in the top left-hand corner. Similarly, it's really easy to place humans as created out of mud on the top right-hand part of the square. Interestingly, there are some people that can be in the top bit. So there's this idea of the Nur Muhammadi, the light of Muhammad, which is a pre-eternal created celestial light that was passed from the prophets all the way from Adam to Muhammad, which is a sort of light thing that which is within the prophet's body. And for Shi'is, this light then passed to the Imams. So prophets and Imams could perhaps be put at the top. That's more of a sort of side point, really. So, angels and humans are quite easy to put in the square. Jinn and devils are a bit more complicated. So in Surah 55:15, the Quran describes the substance of jinn as a marij min nar, meaning smokeless fire or mixed fire. And in another verse, in 15:27, it describes them being created out of nar al-samum, from the fire of the piercing wind. Quite what the Quran means by this is not entirely easy to understand, and it's often a topic for discussion within the exegetical tradition. The Muʿtazilī exegetes, as al-Maṣābīḥ, for example, interprets the idea of being created as out of the nar al-samum as being created from the intense hot vapor that comes out of the body, often the nose, the sort of yeah, if you go through your nose, it's that kind of thing. And it's said to be one of the 70 parts of the vapors created from the fires of hell, out of which God created the jinn. So that's the first one. So there's the fire from hell, which is quite opposed to the light of the angels. Of the other one in Surah 55, about the mixture of fire. Al-Zamakhshari writes, this is referring to the mixture of the pure flame, like the central bit of the flame, which doesn't contain any smoke. It's said that it's mixed and the inner part of the fire, the sawad. I think these two interpretations highlight two really interesting ideas. First, the Quran and later tradition is clear that the jinn are created out of fire, nar, which is obviously a source of light, but is not light itself. It's different in quality to the general concepts of light, like the light of the sun. So the jinn's created substance is not dark, like humans, but neither is it light, like the angels. So the jinn's created substance is going to be somewhere at the bottom of the square, on the neutral axis. This one at the bottom is called the neutral axis. Because they're neither light nor dark. And this kind of accords with how we understand angels, jinn, and humans. So jinn and humans are both earthly creatures. Okay, so they're part of the human world. While angels are of the heavenly realm. But at the same time, we have angels and jinn without a body, a physical body, and humans having a physical body. So you can see how they're somewhere in between those two sort of polar opposites. The sense of jinn being neither light nor dark, or to put it another way, ethereal or bodily, is picked up in a classical kalam theological text of the Hanbali theologian Ibn al-Farāṟ, who writes, the jinn have composite bodies and a consolidated body, but it's possible for them to be delicate, raqiq, and it's possible for them to be dense. So they can be both sort of physical things and they can be airy things, is what he's saying. Which is how the text kind of describes. So you'll see jinn being this very sort of ethereal thing, and sometimes you'll see them as physical beings. So this is a way of trying to understand what's going on there. As far as physical substance is concerned, the devils, the shayateen, fall into the same category as the jinn, as seen in the words of Iblīs about being made of fire. There is some debate between the Muʿtazilīs and the Ashʿarīs, and the Muʿtazilīs seem to say that the jinn are just ethereal beings, but not made of light. So far I've only mentioned one hadith report which clearly draws on the Quranic idea of what angels, jinn and humans are created from. Really oddly, there are very few hadith reports that describe what jinn are made out of. Which is quite interesting in and of itself, because it's quite rare for the hadith literature to not say very much. It usually wants to say everything. And is usually quite confusing to navigate because it says too much. There's a hadith collection called the Mishkat al-Maṣābīḥ, collected in the 11th century, and there's this report. He says, the jinn are of three classes. One class has wings and flies through the air. One is snakes and dogs. And one stays in one place and moves about. Not particularly clear. It doesn't really tell us what they're made out of, but it does talk about physical bodies. And this thing with snakes is really common. So snakes are often described as being jinn. There's one example where somebody comes home from a war, finds a snake in his room, and doesn't know what to do with it. And the Prophet says, he says, there are jinn in Medina who've embraced Islam. When you see one of these snakes, and the jinn may be these snakes, ward him off for 3 days. So you need to say to the snake, you need to get out of my house. I will kill you in 3 days if you don't leave. If the snake is still there, then it's a shaitan and you can kill it. Okay. So there's an association of of jinn inhabiting physical animals. There's another similar one about black dogs. Where every black dog is a devil, a shaitan. It's possible that both of these are about possession, that the jinn possessing snakes and black dogs, but the phrasing seems to suggest that all black dogs are shaitans, which is a bit unfair on black dogs, but that's what the texts say. But it suggests that shaitan can have physical bodies, as can jinn. In general, the hadith literature seems less inclined to describe jinn as being created out of fire, and there's much more emphasis on what it is that jinn do and what can be done to avoid them. And their association is more picks up on things like madness and possession. So the next thing I wanted to look at was benevolence and malevolence. And in this I mean how angels, jinn and demons are benevolent or malevolent towards humans. Let's begin with the angels. It would be quite easy to consider angels as being wholly benevolent and place them in the top left-hand of the square. But there are three ideas that would really challenge that. First is that there are angels that are largely indifferent to humanity and creation as a whole. For example, the angel Ruh that we encountered earlier that continually praises God. Or the angel Israfil who announces the end of time. They have very little interest in humanity at all, so they're completely indifferent. So they're not benevolent, but they're not malevolent either. Similarly, there are the two angels that sit on people's shoulders and note down people's good actions and bad actions. And one hadith says, the scribe of good deeds on the right, the scribe of bad deeds on the left. When he does a good deed, the one on the right writes it down 10 times. So he's being benevolent there. When he does a sinful act, the one on the right says to the one on the left, leave him, and if he praises God or asks for forgiveness, then don't write it down. If he doesn't, then when Thursday comes, the two angels write down everything that the person's done. So the evil angel is also indifferent. They're not being actively malevolent against the human, but is also not being particularly benevolent. The second problem is that there are angels that cause pain and injury to humans, most notably the angels in hell, but also other kinds of angel too. So while it may be tempting to consider angels of hell as demons or devils, in the Muslim understanding, these are angels because they're doing God's work. The Lord of hell, often called Malik, is always described as being an angel and not a devil. And this is made explicit in Surah 74:31, which reads, we have appointed only angels, malaika, to guard hellfire. So the angels are kind of a range of things in that sort of vector of the square. The jinn are similarly complex. As I mentioned earlier, Sinai's argue that the shayateen are a subcategory of jinn, in the sense that the evil jinn are shayateen. And this bears out in the hadith literature, where the terms jinn and shayateen seem to be interchangeable. Although there are some hadith reports which suggest that angels and shayateen are different. For example, during Ramadan, the gates of heaven are opened and the gates of hell are shut, and the devils and the recalcitrant jinn are shackled. So we have two creatures being named, and the implication is that they're different creatures. So this idea that jinn and shayateen are identical may not quite be true, or reflected in the sources. Now, I think there are 4 different types of jinn, and I think there's a range of what jinn do. There are jinn that are benevolent towards humans. The vast majority are completely indifferent to humans and just live in their own jinn world. There are jinn that are mean to humans and malevolent towards humans, but in the same way that humans are malevolent to other humans. Okay, so they're not. So they're just malevolent. But I want to distinguish that between a 4th category, which are jinn, which are malevolent in the sense they're trying to lead people away from God and to lead them to unbelief. And this last category, I think, are the shayateen, or can be associated with the shayateen. But I think we need to distinguish between jinn, which are trying to lead people astray, and jinn just being not particularly nice. So in that sense, we have devils at the top as entirely malevolent, trying to lead people away from God and to unbelief, whereas the jinn operating in this other vector of the square, where some are benevolent, some are indifferent, and some are not benevolent, but not particularly malevolent at the same time. And I think the square is quite helpful because it actually problematizes, it helps us understand what these creatures are doing and how they interact with humans. And I think it helps us understand that if we say that jinn are both malevolent and benevolent, that would put them at the top of the square. And that's not true, because that would mean that a single jinn was both benevolent and malevolent towards humans. But actually, it's the whole category of species which is malevolent and benevolent and applies to different jinn on a case-by-case basis, which is why they're in a slightly different part of the square. The third idea, and this will be the last one, so I'm nearly done, is the idea of obedience and disobedience towards God. This one's a bit simpler. To begin with, the angels are entirely obedient in the Muslim sources. There is a debate in secondary sources about the extent to which angels have free will, but I think in many respects this isn't a particularly useful question, because angels have full knowledge of God's existence, and if you know that God exists, you're going to behave in a certain way, which removes the free will, because there's no real... They have the free will, but they're always going to do what they're told because they know that God exists and they know what God is. So they have knowledge of God rather than a faith in God, which is a distinction between angels and humanity. And that's the same for the devils, but in reverse. So the devils know that God exists, and they are directly trying to subvert God's will. So that puts angels and devils there. I'm going to leave the next bit. We'll leave that. That's quite interesting, but we'll leave that for now. So, where do jinn go in the square? So jinn, like humans, are both obedient and disobedient. So whereas in the previous square I said we couldn't put jinn up there because an individual jinn couldn't be both malevolent and benevolent. This case it is, because an individual human and an individual jinn can be both obedient and disobedient throughout their life. Okay. So they operate in this top half of the square where there are complex characters with complex theological relationships with God, where humans and jinn both fall in and out of a relationship with God. So, I think that's it. So, what I've tried to do today is to explore the world of spiritual beings in Islam through semiotic structures, to understand the relationships between each of the types of spiritual being and how they relate to humans and the created world. The analysis has shown that the complex world of the jinn, the most complex world is the world of the jinn. While angels, humans and devils are often quite easy to conceptualize, the jinn are more difficult to understand and to place within these structures. I think this is in part because the textual sources about the jinn come from a range of sources, especially folkloric popular beliefs that don't necessarily fit in as neatly into a theological worldview. The jinn rarely have a natural opposite. Whereas angels and devils, angels and humans can often form a nice binary pairing in either their created substance or their relationship with God or how they engage with the world. The jinn seem to kind of do their own thing, and they don't always fit into these easily into these. They don't always necessarily have a natural opposite. The moral and physical ambiguity of the jinn can lead to some interesting areas of reflection. The world of the unseen in Islam is not a clear dichotomy of good versus evil, and the jinn blur the lines between the two. But it's not just that the jinn add this sense of ambiguity. We've also seen that the angels also have a range of roles, including some that are entirely indifferent to the world of humans and some which are malevolent towards humans, or our perception of what would be malevolent to humans. The Qur'an can often present angels and spiritual beings with a concrete dichotomy between the things of God and the things that are not of God. But the world after the Qur'an challenges this strict binary, adding more nuance and grey areas. Is this a reaction and a syncretization of local popular beliefs? Is this an acknowledgement of the mysteries of the unknown? I think the only answer really is Allahu Alam, God knows best.
Yes.